think Mafia, what comes to mind? Probably guys from the movies, right? Loud suits, flashy cars. Well, the real story of the most powerful crime family in America, the Genovese family, it's not like that at all. Think less gangster movie, more Wall Street takeover. These guys were quiet, they were strategic, and they built a criminal corporation that's lasted for over a century. So let's get into it.
War is bad for business. That single thought from the family's founder, Lucky Luciano, changed everything. See, before him, crime was just chaos, a bunch of bloody turf wars. But Luciano, he looked at all that fighting and just saw red ink. He knew it was bad for the bottom line. And that one simple, revolutionary business principle, it's what turned street gangs into a national syndicate.
All right, to really get how they built this empire, you gotta go back to the beginning. Picture it, the Lower East Side of New York, early 1900s. It's a tough place, especially for immigrants just trying to survive. And right in the middle of all that poverty and struggle, there's this young kid from Sicily, Salvatore Lucania, and he makes a decision. He's not gonna be a victim of the system. No, he's gonna become the system.
So check out how fast this kid moves. He shows up at Ellis Island in 1906, just 9 years old. 5 years later, he's already running his first racket, charging his classmates for protection. By the 1920s, he's deep in the bootlegging game during Prohibition, working for one of the old school bosses, a guy named Joe Masseria. But Luciano sees these old guys, the mustache Petes they called them, and he just thinks they're dinosaurs, inefficient, stuck in the past. He knew if he was going to build his modern vision of crime, the old guard, they had to go.
And this is the move that changes everything. But don't think of it as just a gangland hit. Oh no, this was a corporate coup, plain and simple. So the story goes, Luciano takes his boss, Joe Masseria, out for lunch. At just the right moment, Luciano excuses himself to go to the bathroom. And that's the signal. In come the gunmen, including a young Vito Genovese, and that's the end of Masseria. Right after, Luciano gets rid of the whole boss of all bosses idea. Instead, he creates the commission, basically a board of directors for the 5 families. Just like that, the old world was gone, organized crime was officially a business.
So, with the old guard gone, the Luciano family, which eventually becomes the Genovese family, gets down to business, and they live by a new, incredibly powerful motto: maximum profit, minimum visibility. The goal was simple: stay out of the papers and just watch the money roll in.
And this is where you really see their genius. I mean, look at this. They set themselves up just like a corporation. You've got a boss, who's like the CEO, an underboss, he's the COO, handling the day-to-day, a consigliere, basically their lawyer and CFO rolled into one. But their most brilliant move? The acting boss. This was pure genius. They'd put a fall guy, a decoy, out in front to be the public face of the family. He'd be the one the FBI was watching, while the real boss, the true CEO, was pulling all the strings from the shadows. It was this perfect shield that made them practically untouchable for decades.
Get ready for this number. $500 million. That's what they were pulling in annually back in the 40s and 50s. In today's money, we're talking billions. Billions. They were more profitable than a lot of legitimate Fortune 500 companies. Which, of course, begs the million-dollar, or I guess billion-dollar question: how in the world do you take that much dirty cash and make it look clean?
Well, for starters, they diversified their portfolio, just like any good business. But look at the biggest piece of that pie, a whopping 40% from unions in the docks. This was the heart of their empire, their absolute, iron-fisted control over the New York and New Jersey waterfront. Think about it. They controlled every single crate coming off every ship. They decided who worked, who didn't, and you better believe they took a cut of everything. They literally had the city's economic windpipe in their hand.
Okay, so this is where the financial wizardry of Luciano's partner, Meyer Lansky, really shines. They basically invented modern money laundering. It's a 3-step dance, and it's brilliant. Step 1, you collect all your dirty cash from things like vending machine rackets. Easy enough. Step 2, this is the tricky part. You fudge the books. That machine that only made $100, on paper, you say it made $500. Now that extra $400 is officially clean income. Step 3, you take all that clean money, send it to an offshore bank, and then you have that bank loan it back to you. Presto. You've got a totally legitimate loan you can use to buy up real estate in Vegas or anywhere else. It was an absolutely flawless system.
But let's be real. This whole sophisticated business machine, it was built on a foundation of something much more primal. For these guys, violence wasn't about anger or passion. Now, it was just a line item on the budget, a cold, calculated business expense you use to maintain order and to balance the books.
And the leadership itself was this perfect, weird balance. On one hand, you had Frank Costello. They called him the Prime Minister. He was the smooth operator, the diplomat, who moved in high society, bribing politicians and judges. On the other hand, you had Vito Genovese, the enforcer, a total tyrant, who basically thought bullets were the only answer. This yin and yang of diplomacy and brutality, it let them control everything, from the halls of Congress right down to the darkest alley.
And the message was crystal clear. Nobody is above the code of silence. Nobody. Case in point, 1951, a high-ranking guy, Willie Moretti, started talking. He had an illness that was making him ramble, making him a security risk. So what did his own brothers do? They took him to lunch, they shared a meal, and then they shot him right there at the table. To them, it wasn't murder, it was a mercy killing, a brutal but necessary business decision to protect the company. The message couldn't have been clearer. Omerta, the code of silence, is absolute.
For what felt like an eternity, these guys seemed completely invincible. But, eventually the government started to catch on. They realized they weren't just fighting a bunch of street thugs. They were up against the shadow government. And so, armed with new laws and a much better understanding of who they were dealing with, the feds finally started to fight back.
And the first major crack in that wall of silence? It came from the inside. In 1963, a Genovese soldier named Joe Valachi breaks the code and testifies before Congress. And he didn't just rat somebody out, he gave the FBI the whole playbook. The organizational chart, the secret rituals, the lingo, everything. He was the one who, for the very first time, publicly named the organization Lucky Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. All of a sudden, this invisible empire had a name and a face.
So, with the feds closing in, how did the family survive? Well, with one of the wildest, most brilliant strategies you've ever heard of. Meet Vincent the Chin Gigante. He takes over as boss in the 80s, and to keep the law off his back, he spends decades, and I mean decades, pretending to be completely insane. He'd wander around Greenwich Village in his bathrobe and slippers, just muttering to himself. The press, of course, had a field day. They called him the Oddfather.
But here's the thing. The bathrobe was just a costume. The whole act was a sham. Behind closed doors, FBI wiretaps told a very different story. Gigante wasn't insane, not even close. He was a sharp, calculating, and absolutely ruthless leader. On one of those taps, you can hear a capo relaying an order about someone who owes money. The order? He says he doesn't have the money? Then take the light out of his eyes, but slowly. That chilling, precise command, that was the real man in charge. And his insane act, it worked. It protected the family for over 30 years.
So what about today? Where does all this leave the Genovese family? Well, they didn't really fall in the classic sense. It's more like they evolved. They adapted. They morphed into a new kind of organized crime. One that's a whole lot harder to see, but is definitely still there. Just look at how they've pivoted. The old street rackets, they've been replaced with sophisticated white-collar crimes. They've literally traded their street corners for servers, their Tommy guns for algorithms. Now they're into things like internet gambling, pump and dump stock fraud, and even cyber extortion. They've gotten so good at infiltrating legitimate logistics companies, you'd never even know they were there. The business model is totally different, but the goal? The goal is exactly the same: control and profit.
Which leaves us with a really big question, right? Is the Ivy League of the Mafia just a legend now? A ghost story you hear about in documentaries? Or have they actually succeeded in their ultimate goal? Have they become a completely invisible network, woven so deep into the fabric of our economy that we can't even see them anymore? That's the real question, isn't it?